or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our Monday webinar series, The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. A special welcome to any first-time attendees, and you can view previous sessions if you'd like using the link that was in the email that you received today, along with the Zoom link. And we're really pleased to have Dr. Rachel Rosenthal teaching us today. She is Assistant Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS, and her session is called Learning Torah from the Talmud's Greatest Gentiles. So I can't wait. And I guess through this session, we're sort of going way back to look at how Jews and others, how Jews interacted with others, kind of in the elite intellectual realm. So Dr. Rosenthal, we can't wait to hear what you have to teach. If all of you are joining us today, if you're feeling inspired by this opportunity of learning with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have two sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Sadiq for $1,000. And to learn more, you can contact learninglives@jtsa.edu. Dr. Rosenthal will pause for questions periodically throughout the session, and we'll also have Q&A at the end. Tani Schwartz-Herman is going to be facilitating a Q&A today, so if you'd like to submit a question for Dr. Rosenthal, you can use the chat feature, send a private chat to Tani Schwartz-Herman, or actually, Tani, are you, I think you're on with JTS Online Learning, is that right? One of those.
There is Tani Schwartz-Herman.
Okay, Tani Schwartz-Herman, thank you. And during the Q&A periods, Tani will select from those questions to pose to Dr. Rosenthal. And if you have a question of a technical or logistical nature, you can send that via the chat to Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were also linked to in today's email. And on that note, I'll just give a little bit more of an introduction to Dr. Rosenthal. As I said, she's Adjunct Assistant Professor of Talmud at JTS and also Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. In addition to those two major roles, she teaches at Central Synagogue and Lincoln Square Synagogue here in New York and a variety of other settings around the world. She is a beloved teacher among JTS students. And Dr. Rosenthal, we're so pleased that you're teaching for us part of this series. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Andelman. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you. And there is a Rabbi Rosenthal, but she is my sister. So we'll separate doctor and rabbi in this particular case. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you today. And when I heard the topic, Judaism and the Other, that JTS is running this semester, the thing that immediately came to mind are the places where non-Jews appear in the Talmud. So one of the things that becomes clear is that the rabbis have a certain degree of suspicion of non-Jews. The place where that suspicion comes from is partly earned, particularly the Romans, because the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and are constant adversaries to particularly the rabbinic Jews, whereas the rabbis feel a little bit more neutral towards the Babylonian non-Jews. It's a much less fraught relationship than the one they have with the Romans. But in any case, part of what we see throughout this rabbinic literature is that these non-Jews, not just non-Jews as a body, who are considered often in conversations of halakha, of Jewish law, but additionally, we have these narrative sections where non-Jews sometimes appear and enter the conversation. And what we're going to look at today are three stories, two of which feature great non-Jews from history. They're not usually known as great non-Jews from history. They're usually known as great leaders from history, although in our context, their lack of affiliation with the Jewish community is going to be relevant. One of whom is not actually named at all. We'll see he's just called a certain Arab, having to do with where he's from. But part of what I want us to think about is how are the rabbis choosing to use these leaders? And one of the things I want us to be aware of is the degree to which the rabbis tell stories about themselves. And the question, I think, should not be, are these stories true historically, but rather, why are these the stories that the rabbis choose to tell, and what might that tell us about how they're perceiving themselves in relationship to the larger world, the world outside of their rabbinic bubble, such as it is. And additionally, what might these stories tell us about questions that the rabbis see as interesting, but also potentially subversive? Because one of the things we're going to see in these stories are the ways in which the rabbis find it challenging to answer certain questions. But an argument that I would like to make is that sometimes what you do is, if you have a subversive question, what you do is you put it in the mouth of someone outside of the rabbinic establishment, and that allows you to ask that sort of question without suggesting that the rabbis might think such a thing. Sometimes these figures are going to be serving as a foil. Sometimes they're going to open up certain conversations. There are a lot of different things happening. So what we're going to start with is 2 introductory texts, which I think lay out the issues that we have to deal with today in a very nice way. So Tani, if you want to share the source sheet, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so what we have here is, we'll start with a piece from the Babylonian Talmud from Sanhedrin. There's actually a number of conversations in Sanhedrin about non-Jews as a group in general. This particular one comes from Rabbi Yochanan, so we can just go back to that second page. Okay, thank you. So this one comes from Rabbi Yochanan, and I'm going to be working out of the English, but feel free to follow along in the language of your choice. So Rabbi Yochanan said, a non-Jew who engages in Torah study is liable to be put to death. As it says, and now he quotes from Deuteronomy 33, Moses commanded us the law, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. This is a verse that might be familiar to some of you, right? It's in our liturgy. Moresha kihila Yaakov, right? So Moses commanded us the law, the Torah, as an inheritance. And so how does Rabbi Yochanan interpret this verse? The way he interprets it is to say it is an inheritance for us and not an inheritance for them. Them here being everyone who is not a Jew. So a couple of notes, just one note about the translation. I translated Oved Kochavim here as non-Jew. Oved Kochavim is literally a star worshiper or an idolater. The rabbis use that interchangeably with other words they use to refer to a non-Jew. This is basically how they categorize non-Jews, because in their time, Christianity was very, very small. It was not ascendant at the point that Rabbi Yochanan lived. And additionally, Islam did not yet exist in the world. And so the majority of non-Jews that they saw were existing in some sort of pagan system. So that's why I'm translating idolater here as a non-Jew. Of course, we wouldn't necessarily apply that label today, but that seems appropriate for looking at this piece. So what we see from Rabbi Yochanan then is this sense that the way that we can divide between Jews and non-Jews in part is through the study of Torah. So that Torah is an inheritance for the Jews, and therefore for non-Jews to engage with this is an inappropriate thing for them to do. So this is version number 1, and not only inappropriate, but actually makes them liable for capital punishment. So that's vision number 1. Vision number 2 comes from Mishnah Avot, chapter 4, Mishnah 1, also known as Pirkei Avot, where we have Ben Zoma ask this question: Ezehu Hakam halomed mikol adam. Who is it that is wise? The one who learns from every person. And every person there, kol adam, does not indicate the one who learns from every Jew, the one who learns from every Israelite. Instead, it's every person. And what is his proof for this? It's from the book of Psalms, chapter 119. From all who taught me, I have gained understanding. So what we see here is that Ben Zoma seems to have a very different vision, theoretically, than Rabbi Yochanan. Now, of course, you can reconcile their 2 statements. How do you reconcile them? You say, Ben Zoma would say, non-Jews are repositories of wisdom, such that we have an obligation to learn even from them. But what we learn from them is not Torah. It's not appropriate for them to engage in Torah. Instead, their wisdom exists in other realms of the world. And this is something the rabbis are aware of in general, that there is an understanding of the idea that non-Jews have wisdom, right? They're interested in things like science and astrology and medicine, right? All of these different things, sometimes philosophy even, all of these different things, they're connected in with the non-Jewish world in terms of engaging with them. But potentially Torah is off limits. So I want to just look at one other piece of this Mishnah from Avot. Most of the rest of it is not relevant for our conversation. But then it goes on to say, right, who is it that is honored? The one who honors his fellow human beings, as it is said, for I honor those that honor me, but those who spurn me shall be dishonored. And this is from the first book of Samuel. So there's this sense, again, of honor being due. And this is something I want us to keep in mind as we go forward into these sources. To what degree do we see honor, respect, wisdom being attributed to these non-Jewish characters, versus to what degree do we see the rabbis are not willing to engage in these conversations? It's important to note that the first source that we saw, the piece from Sanhedrin, that is a single opinion. It's what's called a dat yachid. It's attributed to Rabbi Yochanan. That doesn't mean other people don't possibly agree with him, but we should never take a statement made in rabbinic literature as being indicative of this is what the rabbis think. There's no such thing as this is what the rabbis think. For every position that you can find basically the opposite one as well. And so this tension that might exist is one that we have to be aware of, especially the question of why might Rabbi Yochanan or those like him feel this anxiety about non-Jews learning Torah? Because I think it's important for us to note, right, when he says it's an inheritance for us and not for them, certainly part of what he's doing in saying that is suggesting Torah is special for Jews. But by saying Torah is so special for Jews that a non-Jew who learns Torah should be executed because of it, at least to me, that suggests a certain level of anxiety potentially that exists in Rabbi Yochanan, that he's worried about something happening if non-Jews are given access to Torah. And so we're going to have to think about what that might be and what that might look like. So these are I would say, sort of the two pole opposites in terms of thinking about what does it mean for us to engage intellectually with non-Jews. On one hand, it's forbidden to do so. On the other hand, not only is it meritorious to learn from non-Jews, but actually, if you wish to accumulate wisdom, it's something that you have to do, right? Maybe you need to have wisdom outside of Torah. And so the question of how do we thread that needle, especially if for the rabbis, so much of the way that they engage with the world is through the lens of Torah. Is it possible to engage in these questions without bringing Torah in? And if you have to bring Torah in, then what are the implications of that? So that's by way of introduction. So now what we're going to do is we'll turn to the first of the three sources. And then what I'm going to do is after each of the three stories, I'll pause and make room for questions, et cetera, that people have. But as things come up as we go through the source, feel free to chat them to Tani, and she will graciously keep track of them for us. So the first piece we're going to look at comes from the Babylonian Talmud as well. I am a Talmudist. I study the Babli, so that's why we're going to see a heavy Babylonian Talmud focus here. And this piece comes from Masechet Tamid, which is generally about the daily sacrifice that was brought to the temple. But as is the case in all tractates of rabbinic literature, the rabbis go on some detours, and what we're going to see now is one of the detours. So the story opens up by talking about Alexander the Great. So first of all, I want us to note that Alexander the Great is apparently a character in the Talmud, right? Which I don't think we necessarily would have expected. I think it's a little bit surprising to see these great historical figures who we're familiar with from our non-Jewish textbooks suddenly appear in these stories. And then we have to wonder, what exactly are they doing here? So that's a question that we're going to ask when we get to the end of this source. But what do they have? So we have Alexander of Macedon ask the elders of the Negev being the southern part of Israel, ask the elders of the Negev about 10 matters. So I did not bring all 10 of them here. If you wish to see all 10, you can look them up. If you just Google Talmud 31b, 32a, or Alexander the Great Talmud or anything like that, you'll find the rest of the sources. So I brought a few of them here, and you'll be able to tell where I've cut some out based on where the ellipses appear in the text. So Alexander said to them, meaning these elders, were the heavens created first, or was the earth created first? They, meaning the elders, said to Alexander, the heavens were created first, as it is stated. right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this is obviously a fairly simple proof text. The rabbis say the heavens were created first. How do we know that? Because it says, Et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. First the heavens are listed, and then the land is listed. So this is question number one. How did God physically create the space that exists around us? So there are a number of questions that Alexander asks about the creation of the world. I've brought only one of them here, but then he pivots. So then Alexander says to the elders, who is truly worthy of being called wise? Right. This echoes the Mishnah we saw above with the statement from Ben Zoma. Ben Zoma there had said, who is wise? The one who learns from everybody. But here the elders give a slightly different answer. The elders say, the one who sees the consequences of his behavior. So the idea being, what is wisdom? Wisdom is understanding how what you do in the world affects what it is that you do going forward, right? Meaning, what sort of impacts can my actions have, rather than me just acting willy-nilly, assuming that nothing I do matters, not being aware of consequences. So this is a very interesting definition of wisdom. I'm going to come back to it in a minute, but instead we'll continue reading on this box. So then Alexander said to them, who is called mighty? And they said to him, who is a mighty person? The one who masters his desire. Then Alexander said to them, who is called wealthy? They said, who is wealthy? And this is actually a quote from the Mishnah in Avot, the one who is pleased with his own portion, hasameach bechalko. So what do we have here? We have this great Roman general, on one hand, Alexander, and we have these elders, and the elders are not even named. We don't know which elders they are. And it seems to me that Alexander is basically asking about the core pieces of what he understands to be important in the world, right? What is being important? It's important to be wise, it's important to be strong, and it's important to be rich. And the rabbis, in answering each of these questions, I think in certain ways are refuting what they would understand to be Roman values. So what does it mean to be wise? It doesn't mean to know all of the philosophy, right? One doesn't need to be a Greek or a Roman philosopher in order to be wise. One needs to be aware of their own actions and the ways in which those actions affect the world. What does it mean to be strong? Strength does not come from battles and wars and swords and arrows and all of those things. Again, that's the rabbinic conception of how the Romans understand strength, right? The Romans gain their strength through battle. But for the rabbis, what does it mean to be strong? It actually is about internal self-discipline. That's where strength comes from. And finally, right, what does it mean to be called wealthy? It's not about accumulating land, accumulating jewels, accumulating gold and silver, right? Whatever animals, whatever else it might be. But rather, you're wealthy if you feel wealthy, meaning you're wealthy if you say, wow, look at everything that I have. I don't need anything else. So part of what we have here is the rabbis are setting up a dichotomy between themselves and their own values on one hand, and Alexander and Roman values on the other. And I think that this is important because the rabbis are very much at war with Rome in their minds, that Rome is associated with Edom, with Esau, right? And one of the reasons the rabbis have such hatred towards Esau, towards Jacob's twin brother, is because they look at him and they see this paradigm of Rome, who ultimately comes and destroys Israel. So Alexander also comes and functions here as a stand-in. And you can imagine that Alexander, in asking these questions, right, who is wise, who is mighty, who is wealthy, is expecting answers in line with his own Roman experiences. And this becomes part of the way for the rabbis to differentiate their own values on one hand from the values of the Romans on the other. And in fact, this gets pulled out even further in the next box, where we get this very strange conversation back and forth. So Alexander then says to the rabbis, what must a man do in order that he should live, to ensure that he should live? And they said to him, this man must basically kill himself in order to allow himself to live. And so then you have to look at the commentaries to say, what do you mean that you can only live by killing yourself? And Rashi, the great commentator on the Talmud, explains here that what it means basically is to live moderately, that there is a certain excess associated. Right, people actually talk about this today, right? That if you engage in certain vices excessively, then that could literally kill you. But I think, again, what we see here is Alexander is being used as a foil of sorts for rabbinic values. The rabbinic value of moderation and modesty is in conflict here with the Roman value, because I think if you imagine, if you asked a Roman as the Roman exists in the rabbinic mind, what does it mean to live? They would say, oh, well, you need to conquer all of your enemies, right? You need to destroy your enemies. You need to have all of this land. You need to have a big army. You need to build walls around your city. You need to have access to the top medicine. And the rabbis keep giving these very philosophical answers, which in many ways refute any sort of claims that people might have towards more physical manifestations of desire, of property, all of those things. And I do think it is worth noting that this source is the tradition of this conversation is attributed to the land of Israel. And the land of Israel, as opposed to the Jewish community in Babylonia, the Jews who lived in Israel during this time, they were a much poorer community than the Babylonian community. And part of the way that they deal with that poverty is by claiming that there's nobility in that poverty, right? The claim is basically, yes, we're poor, but it's noble for us to be poor in this way. And certainly that becomes a strong contrast with Rome. So he goes on. So Alexander asks again, what must a man do that he will die, right? This is the contrast of the previous section. What should a person do so that they may live? Here, what should they do that they should die? And they said to him, he must keep himself alive, which, again, to bring Rashi in here to explain what does this mean? Basically, this is someone who's leading a very extravagant and indulgent life, which makes sense, right? Because if the way you live is through moderation, then the way you die is through excess. So those two are very much mirrors of each other. And then Alexander said to the rabbis, what must a man do to ensure that he will be accepted by people? And this is a very interesting question for Alexander, the great leader of Rome, to be asking, right? What must he do to be accepted by people? And they said to Alexander, he must hate the king and the authorities. This is a very bold answer. This one way, I guess we could put it, for the rabbis to give. Because here what we have is they're basically saying to the authority, right, in order for people to be accepted by their community, they have to hate people like you, meaning they have to hate the leader. So so this is the first time Alexander answers one of their statements. So we've been having question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. But here Alexander finally chimes in response, and he says, my way is better than yours, right? He must love the king and the authorities, and he must perform beneficial acts for the people. And this, I think, is a very striking thing, because if you were to say what makes people like you, people will often say, what will make people like you? If you do things for them, right? You ingratiate yourself towards them. So either you give them physical things, you offer them money, you offer them power, maybe you offer them love and friendship, right? That's the less cynical version. And I think Alexander's answer here is very interesting, right? Because Alexander says, no. If you want people to like you, you should make friends with authority. And how do authorities make people like them? The way authorities make people like them is by doing nice things for the people. Excuse me, sorry. So the contrast here, I think, is very important, because the rabbis say there's no way to be beloved and to have a relationship with the authority figures. And the authority figure says back to them, no. If you just do nice things for people, then they will love you. So when we pause in a minute, I want us to think what exactly the implications of that statement might be. But instead, let's finish this text off, and then I'm going to pause to take questions that people might have about this. So we have one more question from Alexander. So then he says to the rabbis, who, mind you, have been basically a identityless blob, right? They're just the elders of the wilderness. We don't know who they are. We don't know who is among them, and I think that is intentional on the part of the author of this story. It's not, certainly not unheard of for people just to be referred to as quote unquote the rabbis, such as they are. But I do think it's worth noting that it's important. Their anonymity in this story is particularly important. So Alexander said to them, "Who among you is wiser?" Right? So you have been answering me as a unit. Now I would like you to divide yourselves. Tell me, who among you is wiser? And what did they say to him? They said to him, "We are all equal. As every matter you say to us, we solve for you unanimously." So what we have here is, right, they are presenting a united front. And this is if you've spent any time with rabbinic literature, you know that this is a little bit of a funny answer, because the rabbis often are in conflict with each other. That's like basically the whole point of the Talmud, right? The Talmud is rabbis being in conflict with each other, trying to work out these disagreements, trying to understand the parameters of them, trying to resolve them, etc. So the idea that suddenly they're unanimous, it shows it. Part of what it does is it highlights the degree to which Alexander is an outsider, because it seems to me at least that part of what's happening here is there is an anxiety among the rabbis. We have to present a united front to this outsider. When we're inside, we can argue and be in conflict, but in this particular case, it's very important that we show him actually we all are in concert with each other. We all agree with each other. So Alexander said to the rabbis, "What is this? Right? What, by which do you oppose me? Meaning, since you are my subjects and my people meaning the Romans constitute the majority, you should concede that our lifestyle is superior." The idea being, if you rabbis think it's important to have unanimity and to be functioning as a unit rather than as distinct from one another, then there's no reason for you to be distinct from the Romans. And if we're going to decide who should we see as quote unquote correct, the Romans or the rabbis, well, guess what? If we're going to suggest that majority rules and that majority's opinion becomes the unanimous opinion we should be following, well, who's going to present the majority opinion? The majority opinion is going to be the Romans. So therefore, you rabbis should act like the Romans. And what did the rabbis say back? This is a great punchline, I think. Even the Satan is victorious, which is sort of, I think this is a slightly harsher version of even a wrong clock is right twice a day, even a stop clock is right twice a day, right? The idea being that just because your people are the majority, that doesn't mean that you're correct, because sometimes Satan triumphs, and we shouldn't take the fact that you have been able to, in this moment, access unanimity among your people, meaning among the Romans, to mean that you're automatically correct. And instead, we believe that we are correct. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. And if people have been sending in questions, or if you want to chat them in now, I'm happy to try to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. And just we had a few questions at the beginning, but I'm just waiting for more of the questions on the recent texts to come in. One question that came up also was just about which translation you were using, if you don't mind just sharing.
Sure. So these are modified versions of the Steinsaltz translation. So this is the new Steinsaltz Koran translation, which is also what you would find on Sefaria. So I used that as a backbone, and then did a little bit of editing, tinkering. They insert a lot of commentary, so I pulled most of their commentary out. But I do find that as far as translations of the Talmud go, short of doing my own, which ordinarily I would aspire to do, but right now I have a newborn, so unfortunately it didn't happen this time. Short of that, I find that this is by far the most accessible of the translations, and it's on the internet for anyone to find, so I recommend it.
Okay, now I'm seeing that. I think because I had the share screen up, I missed some of the chats coming in. Well, it was a question also just about the context, like what year, if you can just share the year that this was in.
Oh, yes, certainly. So the Mishnah, which is the text from Avot, the Mishnah is dated to around the year 200 of the Common Era. So roughly 130 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, which is relevant because the Roman narratives that we have coming up here, that we just covered, are going to be basically contemporary with the writing of the Mishnah. The Babylonian Talmud, the dating of it is a little more complicated, but let's date it to around the year 500, give or take 50 years on either end. So somewhere between 450, 550, maybe even as late as 600. But the Babylonian Talmud is a layered text. So it has people from as early as the year, say 50, going as late as the year 500, 550, whenever it is the text is closed. The narrative sections, which are what we're looking at right now, the narrative sections are generally assumed to be written a little bit later. So they're probably in the year 450, 500 range. But they're possibly reflecting earlier traditions. The question of dating these texts is always one of the challenges that we have. So, but those dates are approximately correct, I would say. And then Rabbi Yochanan, who's the one who made the statement about how non-Jews are forbidden from learning Torah, he's also on the earlier side as far as rabbinic literature goes. He lives in about the year 250.
Thank you. A few questions came in just to clarify Alexander, whether he was Greek or Roman, or which Alexander.
Oh, we are dealing here. Oh, I've been saying Roman, but we've been dealing here with the Greek Alexander. So I apologize. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Alexander the Great. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let me just do.
And by the way, for the rabbis, the Greeks and the Romans, obviously distinct, sort of seen as like the bad polytheistic occupying powers. Romans are much worse than Greeks, but they mostly don't have good things to say about the Greeks either. And don't tell my 6th grade teacher that I mixed those things up.
Sorry, I'm just catching up on some of the other questions that came in. Let's see. Just give me. Okay, an interesting question was just, what's the likelihood that the conversation actually took place as opposed to kind of a story that was told?
So this is a great question. I would say it is unlikely that this actually historically took place. It's not impossible. I would not say it definitely didn't, but I certainly would not stake my life on it. We'll see actually in the next story that we're going to look at as well, where the rabbis imagine a conversation with Cleopatra of Egypt, where the rabbis really imagine themselves as being engaged in conversations with the most powerful non-Jewish leaders. So Alexander, Cleopatra, Vespasian appears, Shapur, who is the king of Babylonia, he appears frequently actually. And while it's historically possible, because there were people whose job it was to liaise between whoever the ruling non-Jewish government was and the Jewish community, the rabbis present themselves as being much more normative and much more powerful than they actually were historically speaking at this moment. In the time of the Talmud, the majority of Jews were not what we would now call rabbinic Jews. So all of us, no matter our religious affiliation, anyone on this call who identifies as Jewish is a rabbinic Jew, I guess, unless you're a Karaite or a Jew for Jesus. But basically any Jew you meet today is going to be what we call a rabbinic Jew. But historically speaking, that consolidation of Jewish identity around the rabbinic experience doesn't actually happen until probably around the 8th century. So the idea that this particular sect of an already minority group that was really at odds with, say, the Roman government would be having long philosophical conversations with the leaders of that government, historically speaking, it seems very unlikely. And that's why I think it becomes really interesting to ask the question of why do the rabbis choose to write these stories, assuming they're not reflective of history? If they are reflective of history, we can ask the question of why did they choose to write these stories down, although I think we can understand why, right? If you're the rabbis and you're hanging out with Alexander the Great, you want to show that off. But I think under the assumption that it is more likely that these interactions didn't actually happen, what sort of story are the rabbis trying to tell when they create these dialogues? What are they doing with that? And that's a question that we're definitely going to come back to at the end of this class, because I think it might be the most important question in looking at these texts.
Right. That was another question that I had to kind of think about that, like the purpose of the story. Yeah. Maybe it sounds like you'll get to that at the end. Okay, so perhaps I think we can probably move on to the next story then.
Great. Okay, let's go see Cleopatra. Okay, so we're going to move on in the source sheet.
Okay. Let me see if, all right.
And I'm
Just give us 1 second. We're gonna,
Yes,
get it on
thank you.
in a second.
Okay, thank you. So if we can just scroll up a little bit, we're not mode. Yes. There you go. Okay, thank you. So we are now jumping back to Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is 11 chapters long altogether. And it's primarily about the construction of legal systems. So civil law, capital law, there's a lot of attention paid to death penalties. I actually wrote my entire dissertation about the 8th chapter of Sanhedrin, which is about particularly the case of the stubborn and rebellious son. But the last chapter of Sanhedrin, chapter in the Mishnah, it's chapter 10, in the Talmud, it's chapter 11, is what's called Perek Chelek. And the reason why it's called Perek Chelek is because it's about who has a chelek, who has a place of share in the world to come. And the way that the Mishnah is set up is the Mishnah basically starts out by saying every Jew has a place in the world to come. But it's pretty clear that that header is actually added later, because the whole rest of the chapter is about different people throughout history, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who do not have a share in the world to come. The idea is they've done things that are so bad that even once they go through some sort of purgatory-like experience, they never get to go to the world to come. And Perek Chelek, this last chapter of Sanhedrin, is a very unusual chapter in that there is of Talmud, in that there is basically no legal material at all. It is a purely narrative chapter. And for that reason, it's very dense, but it's also very, very rich. And part of what ends up happening is, among other things, because some of the people on the list of people who don't have a place in the world to come are not historical non-Jews, and also because the question of what does it mean for the world to be redeemed by the Messiah, right, to create the world to come, is a deep philosophical question. Part of what we're going to see here is there are a number of narratives that come forward pondering these very big philosophical questions of what is it going to be like when the world is redeemed? What is the Messiah going to be like? How are we going to know when the Messiah is coming? There are all of these different pieces that are going to be at play. And again, some of these core questions we're going to see are created are asked by these major rabbinic figures who are asked to these major rabbinic figures by non-Jewish leaders. And part of the benefit of doing that, as we're going to see, is sometimes going to be you allow these non-Jews to ask questions that the rabbis find interesting, but wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable answering themselves. And the reason why this is important is because all of a sudden, topics that would be off limits, or that maybe would seem to suggest that the rabbis have doubts about fundamental aspects of Jewish faith or Jewish life, etc., all of those different pieces that you would never want to put in the rabbi's mouth, well, if you put it in the mouth of the non-Jewish leader, the rabbis have no choice but to answer. And all of a sudden, look, now they have this opportunity to engage in conversation with these topics, to engage in these thought exercises of what does it mean for us to ask these kinds of questions without basically risking heresy through doing so. So we open here with Queen Cleopatra. Queen Cleopatra appears 2 times in the Babylonian Talmud. She appears here in Sanhedrin, and she also appears in the tractate Nida. Nida is all about menstrual purity laws, and they actually tell this very strange story about Cleopatra functionally experimenting on maidservants around issues of fertility and menstruation. It's very strange. So we're not going to look at that today. We're going to look instead at this philosophical piece. So what we start here with is Cleopatra and Rabbi Meir. So Queen Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir. She said, I know the dead will live, as it is written. She quotes here from the book of Psalms, and they may blossom out of the city like the grass of the earth. But when they arise, will they arise naked or will they arise in garments? So before we read Rabbi Meir's answer, interesting to note that Queen Cleopatra seems to know the book of Psalms to the point where she can quote the verse, right, from the book of Psalms. And she accepts the fundamental premise of resurrection of the dead, which is also worth noting, because you can very much imagine that Queen Cleopatra is existing in a different sort of belief system where, there's certainly a conception of afterlife, but that conception of afterlife does not necessarily align with what the rabbis' conception therefore will be. And so this is, right, going back to that question of, should we assume historically speaking that this happened? This is a good example of a reason why we shouldn't, because the odds that Cleopatra is able to quote rabbinic or Jewish scripture, right, to quote from the book of Psalms, not rabbinic, biblical scripture, and B, that she accepts a fundamental, what the rabbis consider to be a fundamental premise about resurrection of the dead, shows us that they're very much imposing their own belief system onto her. And instead, it's asking this very specific sort of question, right? It's a little bit of a strange question to be asking, but this is her question, right? Will they arise naked or will they arise with their garments? So Rabbi Meir said to her, we can make a kal v'chomer, so an a fortiori argument, or if we write all the more so argument, might be a better way to translate it. We can make an all the more so argument from wheat. Okay, what do we mean? If wheat, which is buried naked, meaning you put the seed itself directly into the ground, emerges with several garments of chaff, i.e. the wheat kernels, you put them into the ground as just the seeds, but when they grow out, the seeds are surrounded by the chaff. All the more so with the righteous who are buried with their garments, that they will arise in their garments. So what do we have here? We have this idea. So Cleopatra asked this very specific question. Yes, I believe the dead will be resurrected, but will they be naked or clothed? And Rabbi Meir says, of course they'll be clothed. How do we know they'll be clothed? Because wheat is clothed. And if wheat, which is just wheat, gets the dignity of coming up with clothing and also is put into the grounds naked, all the more so for people who, A, are buried with clothing on, and B, for people there's assumed to be a lack of dignity that's associated with not having clothing. And of course, we want to give those people that dignity. So part of what I want us to think about as we go forward from here is why is it that this is the question Cleopatra is asking, right? It's actually a very strange question. It's an extremely specific question. And it seems a little bit weird that of all the questions that someone might have about the resurrection of the dead, this seems like an odd one to be fixated on. It feels to me actually very much like a child's question. This seems like the sort of thing a child would ask. They hear about this idea of resurrection and they want to know, are we naked or clothed? And it's also an interesting question in light of what we see in the book of Genesis, where people, meaning Adam and Eve, are originally created without clothing. And it's only once they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they become aware of their nakedness, and then God makes them clothing that they wear. So this idea of nakedness as, in certain ways, our original state, almost a primal state for us on one hand, and on the other hand, there's a dignity associated with clothing, and therefore, of course, we would return with our clothing. So, so that's piece number one. So this is Cleopatra and Rabbi Meir, and the Gemara goes on from here. And now, instead of having Cleopatra and Rabbi Meir, we have the Roman emperor and Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel, this is the one that seems to me more likely to happen, and I will tell you why, which is Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi, which means he is literally, Nasi means prince. He is the leader of the Jewish community. And in addition to his job as the head of the rabbinic community in Israel, and in addition to his job as the head of the court and the head of the Beit Midrash, the head of the house of study, his job is also to liaise with the non-Jewish government, including potentially to offer bribes. So if someone is going to go and have a conversation with the Roman emperor, it is most likely to be Rabban Gamliel. I still am not inclined to see this as historic. I don't think the rabbis necessarily want us to see it as historic, but I don't think it's an accident that Rabban Gamliel is the one who appears in this particular story, as opposed to a different rabbi who doesn't have that same degree of power and prestige associated with him. So the Roman emperor says to Rabban Gamliel, again, continuing this conversation about the resurrection of the dead, which, as I said, is one of the main themes of this chapter of Talmud. The Roman emperor said to Rabban Gamliel, you say that the dead will live. Aren't they dust? And does dust come to life, right? Because this, of course, is one of the fundamental challenges with the idea of resurrection of the dead, which is if there is meant to be some sort of bodily resurrection, which, by the way, later Jewish philosophers debate about whether they think there's going to be a bodily resurrection or whether it's going to be a spiritual resurrection. That's what Maimonides thinks. He thinks there is not going to be a physical body, but it seems in the Mishnah that there's an assumption that there will be a physical resurrection. So, right, you said the dead will live, but the problem is that when someone is buried, if you leave their body buried long enough, of course, eventually it decomposes and just becomes dirt. So does dust come to life? So this is very interesting. So the Roman emperor's daughter says to Rabban Gamliel, I'm going to answer my father, right? Rabban Gamliel himself does not actually answer the question. And instead, the Roman emperor's daughter chimes in and says, leave him and I will respond to him. There are two craftsmen in our city. One fashions vessels from water and one fashions vessels from mortar. Which is more noteworthy? The emperor said to her, it is the craftsman that fashions vessels from water, right? Because the idea being, how are you making something out of water? Water is amorphous, it's going to dissolve. So if I'm trying to build some sort of sculpture out of water, the water is not going to maintain its shape. Instead, it's going to sort of fall apart in some sort of way. And so the daughter said to him, again, what we see is this a fortiori sort of argument, and all the more so argument. So his daughter said to him, if he fashions a vessel from water, meaning if we're going to say that there's a sculptor who can make vessels from water, is it not all the more so clear that he can fashion vessels from mortar? So it seems to me that what we have here in this particular story is that obviously the craftsman that makes from water is meant to be God, right? The craftsman that makes from mortar is a person, human understanding. But I think the other piece is that the mortar is the body and the water is the soul, right? The mortar is the physical part of us that we walk around with, but the water is the things that make us essentially who we are. And the idea is, if God can resurrect our souls, then of course God can resurrect our bodies. And the fact that our bodies have dissolved is actually irrelevant to the larger conversation, because the larger piece here is God is going to be able to resurrect the parts of us that are who we are. And again, this is part of what's very interesting here is, again, what we see is the Roman emperor himself seems to be accepting the premise of resurrection of the dead and is simply questioning the logistics of how it will happen. And the role of the daughter here, I think, is really interesting, because this is exactly the sort of argument that we can imagine Rabban Gamliel making. We can imagine Rabban Gamliel saying, this is how we should explain the resurrection of the dead. And it's really interesting to me here that the rabbis write this story without Rabban Gamliel himself answering. That Rabban Gamliel is sort of left on the side. And it's only through his daughter that that an answer is given to the emperor. So if we think about these two stories, right, Rabban Gamliel and the emperor, Rabbi Meir and Cleopatra, part of what is going to come forward for us here is that the rabbis are asking, or the rabbis have these figures asking what are really very technical questions. Both Cleopatra's question and the emperor's question are extremely tactile in nature, right? One of them is about clothing, one of them is about the physical body, but neither of them are about the spiritual aspects of resurrection of the dead. And part of what that does feels similar to me to what happened above with Alexander, this sense that the values of these leaders, and now what we've had a Roman leader, an Egyptian leader, and a Greek leader, right? It's interesting that we've seen all three. But in addition to that, part of what we notice here is that there's this sense that these leaders are in certain ways keyed into good questions to ask, But on the other hand, they're so focused on the physical aspects of the world, whether it be clothing, whether it be riches, whether it be adoration of your people, which I guess is not physical, but it's very temporal. Whether it be the physical body, right? This focus on the these very tactile but also ephemeral aspects. And the rabbis are basically saying in response, you should be thinking bigger, right? You need to think beyond the here and now. You need to think beyond your physical body. You need to think beyond your clothing. You need to think beyond, how can I get more money? How can I get more power, in order to understand the things that will bring you, on the other hand, this eternal life. And if we go back to Rabbi Yochanan's statement from the very beginning, where Rabbi Yochanan said, the one who teaches a non-Jew Torah, the non-Jew who learns Torah, they're liable to be put to death. It feels to me like that claim is both, and by the way, Rabbi Yochanan postdates all of these figures who we're looking at here. Rabbi Yochanan is in certain ways bringing to actuality part of what we have here in these sources, which is, you can't learn Torah with these people, because even when they're engaging with the right ideas, they're asking the wrong questions. And while it's good and noble that they're asking questions at all, and that's right, it's good that they accept the premise of the resurrection of the dead, for example, but the point of the resurrection of the dead is not, are we wearing clothing? The point of the resurrection of the dead is, God is bringing back our souls. And so in that, what I see as I think indictment is too strong of a word, but in that assertion of the idea that at the end of the day, there are good questions to ask about this, and then there are ways to be focused on the wrong thing, that part of what might be happening here is those physical foci, the rabbis want to draw attention to them, but don't want to have a rabbinic figure asking those questions themselves. And therefore, part of what we do here is we find a way to put those questions in the mouths of the people who would not go so far as to reject this fundamental premises, like, for example, resurrection of the dead, but also lack the sophistication, such as the rabbis imagine it, the sophistication of rabbinic thought, which allow them to see certain beyond certain realities that others might lack the ability to see and understand. So again, I will pause here before we go to the last source from Moed Katan, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. A few people asked about whether or not could the daughter be Rabban Gamliel's daughter?
So it's a very good question. Theoretically, it is possible. That's not usually how the text is read or understood, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. We don't necessarily know of Rabban Gamliel having a daughter, but that doesn't really mean anything, because the rabbis generally are concerned with sons and not daughters. It would be interesting to read the story as, this is Rabban Gamliel's daughter, and then if it were, right, the Roman emperor is asking such a question that it's such a silly question that, like, even a girl can answer it, right? Which I certainly don't mean as disparaging towards women and their intelligence in any ways, but very much reflects the rabbinic idea that it's basically useless to try to teach women Torah. So that would be a way of sort of sticking a thumb in the eye of the intelligence of the emperor, that even Rabban Gamliel's daughter could answer the question. It's interesting to think about how the dynamics would play out if we read it as the emperor's own daughter, or if we read it as Rabban Gamliel's daughter. How does the story feel different to us? Just because it's not the conventional reading of the text does not in any way mean it's incorrect, because it's not conclusive one way or the other in the text.
Thank you. Is it possible that the discussion in some way was like a reflection on, the resurrection of Jesus? Is that, was it connected to that at all? Or?
Again, anything is possible. The rabbis do talk explicitly about Jesus. I guess I could have done that as a Judaism in the other class, maybe next time. But there are a number of conversations about Jesus elsewhere in the Talmud. The rabbis mostly live in a time before Christianity becomes a major force. And so when they talk about Jesus, it's more to make fun of the idea of Jesus and his apostles than to be threatened by the Christian system. But, the rabbis accept the premise of resurrection of the dead very much. And they seem, as we see, they assume it's a bodily resurrection. So you wouldn't necessarily need to bring forth that idea as a refutation of Christianity in a way that we might imagine otherwise.
Another question was the extent to which the rabbis were familiar with the Egyptian ideas around resurrection of the dead.
That's a great question. I have no reason to think, or we historically have no reason to think that they were super informed about it, but they likely had some degree of understanding, if only through their reading of the Bible, right? Like the Bible doesn't actually talk about resurrection of the dead, but we see frequently throughout the Bible, not just in the book of Exodus, which is the most famous example, but also elsewhere, for example, in the book of Kings, mentions of interactions between Egyptian authority and the Israelites. And so I do think that they are aware of the intense physicality associated with that. Like I have very strong memories of being taken to the Met when I was in 5th grade and looking at all the things that were buried with the Pharaoh, right? Because the idea was anything you buried with the Pharaoh, he would get to take with him to the next life. And that's why I see this almost as a rebuke to physicality, that asking questions about physicality, those are not the right questions, because particularly for the Egyptians, there is this very physical association with death, right? That you bring your items from life in order to bring them with you into the next world. And I think the rabbis want to reject that idea. And so as much as they say, sure, you'll be resurrected with clothes, they also say that's not really the point, right? When the Messiah comes, you're not going to worry about how much stuff you have. That's not going to be the main question that you have in that moment.
Do we have time for another question, or?
Yeah, we can do another one.
Okay. So didn't the Egyptians have their own wisdom literature, which might have asked similar questions to what the rabbis, were asking? And I guess there are those who say that our Psalms may have borrowed from them in certain ways.
Yes, the Egyptians have their own wisdom literature. The Greeks do, and the Romans do. Saul Lieberman, who was one of the great professors in the history of JTS, wrote a lot about the relationship between Greek philosophy and the rabbinic tradition. So you can find books and articles about this by Dr. Lieberman. So certainly the rabbis had access to this. It seems that there was a degree of debate about whether or not it was acceptable to access that sort of wisdom literature. And yes, definitely those ideas make it into later bodies of biblical literature as well, and certainly into the rabbinic tradition, including some of the language, not so much Egyptian language, but you see the borrowing of words from Greek and Latin. So you definitely see the ways in which that culture does influence and integrate into the rabbinic tradition as well. So it's not so black and white. It's not so us and them. I don't know how much, though, the rabbis would want to admit that they were taking from those traditions, except for to show the ways in which their own traditions were superior to the ones coming out of those other cultures. Like they do compare themselves sometimes with Roman ideas and ideals, but mostly do so to show, look how much better our ideas and ideals are than the ones being put forward by the Romans.
Okay, thank you. I just had one question about kind of more generally the impetus behind using famous leaders as part of these questions, but I think maybe that's something you'll probably get to at the end too, kind of just
I'll say one thing about that quickly, and then we'll go to the next source, which is actually about a totally anonymous person, which is part of the reason you do this is because it makes the rabbis look powerful, right? If you are part of a minority culture that is constantly struggling for power with the majority of culture, right, that's around you, whether it be the Babylonians or the Romans or the Greeks. And I don't think it's an accident that while the rabbis do write stories about interactions that they have with Babylonian leadership, those tend to not be the same sort of philosophical conversations. Conversations around philosophy tend to happen with the Romans and the Greeks, which is just interesting to note. But I think part of what it is not only if we have to interact with the non-Jewish world, look, we're interacting with these very important leaders. And not only that, but those leaders respect us enough to ask us questions. And not only do they respect us enough to ask us questions, but we know better than them, right? Because if you're just having this conversation with a random Roman that you met in the marketplace, it's not so impressive at the end of the day. But if you have if you have Caesar, or if you have Alexander the Great, or if you have Cleopatra coming and asking these questions, where it seems that part of the role of these questions is not actually to find the answer, but rather to stump the rabbis, and the rabbis are able to answer them so easily. Part of what that does is it shows the wisdom of the rabbis, and I think that that's important to them. This makes them look powerful, right? We engage in philosophical conversations with the emperor of Rome. What does that say about us? And the other thing it does is, right, because as I mentioned, the rabbinic culture at this moment is actually a minority culture, even among the Jews. Part of what it does is it allows the rabbis to stake claims as sort of the equivalents of the Caesars and the right, the emperors of the other communities, right? We're the ones who are wise and powerful and have relationships with others who are powerful as well. It becomes an indirect way to assert rabbinic authority. So let's go on to the last of the sources, and then of course we'll take more time for questions at the end. So this last source is actually very different from the previous ones. And again, these are all just a sampling. These are not the only places where these kinds of stories appear. But this last source doesn't feature an emperor. It doesn't feature a general. It doesn't feature a Caesar. Instead, it features, as we'll see, a certain Arab. Arab is not meant to be derogatory, just to be clear. Just in case people thought otherwise, it's not meant to be derogatory. It's just indicative of where he's from. And in the Talmud, Arabs are particularly known for being often traveling merchants or the like. And part of the reason why that matters is it means that rabbis often encounter them when they're sort of on the way somewhere or other. So this story comes from Moed Katan. And it comes from chapter 3 of Moed Katan. Chapter 3 of Moed Katan is the primary source that we have for information about rituals around death and mourning. So issues around burial, issues around Shiva, funerals, the tearing of the clothing, et cetera, all of these other pieces. These all come from the last chapter of Moed Katan. And in the middle of the chapter, there's a series of stories about what happened when certain rabbis died. And mostly these stories are about eulogies and the sorts of eulogies that were given, for these rabbis when they died. But there's also questions about their burials and how exactly their burials work. So what we have here is the story of two rabbis who apparently died at the same time, or at approximately the same time. So the Gemara goes on here and says, when Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Hamnuna died, they took them both up to there, meaning to the land of Israel. So Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Hamnuna are both Babylonian rabbis, but as is the custom among some people today as well, apparently people who were you would have to be both prominent and wealthy. You couldn't just be prominent, you would have to also have wealth. Their bodies would be sent so that they could be buried in the land of Israel. That was seen as a meritorious thing to have happen. So, but it makes sense, right? If you have one person who died, maybe what you want to do is wait until you have a few other bodies before you send them all over, because it's not a short trip you can't just get on El Al. So when they reached a bridge, the camels stood and would not cross the bridge. So the bodies are being pulled on, each on their own bier, on their own, I assume they're in some sort of wagon or something like that. And they get to this bridge, and all of a sudden these two camels, each of which is pulling one of these coffins, they stop and they don't cross the bridge. And it's going to turn out that this bridge is very narrow. And part of why that matters is that the two camels cannot cross the bridge together. They can only cross the bridge one at a time. So a certain Arab said to them, what is this? Right, them presumably being the people who are transporting the bodies, right? What is this? What's going on? Why are you not moving? And they said to him, the sages are showing honor to each other. The sages being Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Hamnuna are showing honor to each other. It is as if one sage is saying the master should go first, while the other sage is saying the master should go and cross first, right? So the idea being, it's a very supernatural sort of thing happening. The camels are somehow channeling the energy of the bodies of these two deceased rabbis. And the camels, in the course of doing so, neither one of them wants to move because they both worry that going first would be disrespectful to the other one. So both of them are saying, no, you first, no, you first. And this happens occasionally if you've ever, had someone holding a door open for you, no, you go, etc. Here it's a little bit more fraught, obviously, because we're talking about dead bodies, and the assumption is basically whoever goes first, the claim is that they are owed more honor. So this seems to me to be a genuine problem because someone has to go first. Otherwise, you're going to just stay at this bridge forever, right? Somebody is going to have to go first. There's no way around it. They can't go at the same time. So somebody has to make a decision. So what does the Arab say? He makes a conclusion that feels fairly reasonable to me. He says, by law, Dina, right? Dina, who it is by law, or you can even say it is logical, because the word din, which means law, is also often associated with logic. So by logic, Rabba bar Huna should go first. And we'll see a little more of this later on, but the assumption as to why Rabba bar Huna goes first is because Rabba bar Huna is the reason why he is known by his own name, the son of his father's name. Bar means the son of, is because his father was also a great Torah scholar, whereas Rav Hamnuna was a great Torah scholar, but he is not known as the son of his father, which suggests that his father was an ignoramus maybe, or at minimum, not a great Torah scholar. And so the idea here seems to be, if you have two people of equal stature, what do? You go to the previous generation in order to figure out who is owed the greater honor, because you're not gonna be able to figure it out just from dealing with this one generation. Okay, so once the Arab says this, what happens? The camel carrying Rabba bar Huna then passed first, right? So it seems that the camels are persuaded by the Arab's logic. But what happens next? The molars and the other teeth of this Arab all fell out, and this seems to be a punishment because he diminishes the dignity of Rav Hamnuna. So my problem with this, and the story keeps going, which we'll see in a minute. So there are a number of problems with this, actually, I think, but one of the problems that I have with this is somebody is going to have to go first. Otherwise they're going to be standing at this bridge forever. Somebody is going to have to go first. The Arab gives a fairly good reason for sending Rabba bar Huna first, which is he should go first because he has two generations of honor, whereas Rav Hamnuna only has one generation of honor. And the Arab is able to break this stalemate, which seems important to me, and yet he's punished by losing all of his teeth, so, which seems like a terrible punishment to me, right? He now has no more teeth because he was willing to make a decision that nobody else was willing to make. So let's continue on and see what happens next. Okay, so now they make it to the land of Israel, and the bodies are going to be buried. And there's a child. One of the interesting things in the Talmud is that often, for some reason, in whatever sort of death and funeral situations, often children are the ones who give eulogies, and the reason seems to be that the children know which tradition they somehow spontaneously know which verse of the Bible you should be citing. So what happens? So a certain child opened his eulogy, and what does he say? The shoot of an ancient line, meaning Rabba bar Rav Huna, who is a descendant, as I said, of great people, has ascended from Babylonia, and with him is the Book of Wars. So this Milchamot, Sefer Milchamot, Book of Wars, is a reference to Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna was known for his greatness of Torah, and the Torah is referred to in the Book of Numbers as the Wars of the Lord, Milchamot Adonai. So therefore, the Book of Wars is a reference to Rav Hamnuna. So then the eulogy goes on. I'm more interested in that first part of the eulogy, but we'll read the rest of it for completion's sake. The eulogy goes on. The curses of the pelican and the bittern, which are symbols that you see in the book of Isaiah of the destruction of the temple, have doubled, meaning extra destruction have now come upon the people, to see the ruin and the brokenness that has come from Shinar. Shinar is a reference to Babylonia. It's a poetic name for Babylonia. And the idea here is right? Why is it double destruction? Because both Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Hamnuna have both died. So that's why it's a doubling of the destruction. The child goes on. The Lord became angry with his world and seized souls from it, and he rejoices over them when they come to him like a new bride. God who rides upon the clouds is joyous and happy when an innocent and righteous soul comes to him. So the idea being that God is happy in heaven because Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Hamnuna are both with him in heaven, but it's meant to be a punishment for the earth. God is angry with people on the earth, and that is why God took these great leaders away. And the reason why I wanted to make sure we looked at not only the story with the Arab whose teeth fall out, but also this part about the eulogy, is that what's striking to me is that when you look at the eulogy, the opening of the eulogy 100% mirrors exactly what happens with the Arab, right? What happens? The child starts with Rabba Bar Puna and refers to his lineage, and then goes to Rav Hamnuna second and does not mention Rav Hamnuna's lineage. There is no mention of the child having all of his teeth fall out. So that is worth noting, right? That nothing to say that the teeth of the child falls out. We have no reason to think that there is a punishment that comes to this child. And yet what we have is the Arab is punished with this loss of all of his teeth. So apart from the question of why is it that the punishment takes the form of this loss of teeth, and I have a feeling it has something to say, there are probably two answers to that, so, or probably more than two, but two I can think of. One answer that we can give is that we mentioned the teeth in particular because rabbinic scholars are often called shinana, which means sharp-toothed one. So there's something about teeth and wisdom that are associated with each other elsewhere, which is interesting. And also, of course, right, his downfall sort of comes through speaking, and therefore his punishment. If you don't have any teeth, it's difficult to speak. If you've ever spent time with a 5 or 6 year old who's in the process of losing all of their teeth, something you'll notice is they often have sort of a lisp, because it turns out that part of the way we make certain sounds are with our tongue pushing up against our teeth. So I think that that's why that's the punishment. But it's just very striking to me that the child doesn't share the punishment with the Arab, which then raises the question of why is it the Arab who makes this decision as opposed to somebody else? And it seems fairly clear to me that part of what's happening in this story is it is useful for the rabbis to protect any rabbis from having to disparage Rav Hamnuna in this way, right? So what do? You're at this bridge, you're stuck, you need somebody to go first. None of the rabbis want to make a decision about who should go first. It's uncomfortable for them to do so for a number of potentially obvious reasons. And therefore, what do? They put it in the mouths of an other, right? They put the conclusion that is necessarily drawn in the mouths of an other. And in the course of doing so, they're able to both solve this problem of how do we know who goes first without forcing one of the rabbis to choose one person versus the other. And so in this case, unlike the previous sets of sources where what we really saw was the conversation was about asserting rabbinic power, here it actually seems to me that part of what's happening is we have this desire to insulate the rabbis, the Jewish community, whatever else you call it, from the punishments in light of the fact that it is necessary to make a decision, but that they themselves don't want to make the decision because of what it might suggest in terms of the way they see Rav Hamnuna. So instead, they have a neutral third party who's not necessarily invested in showing honor to Rav Hamnuna in the same way that the other rabbis might be. But then he gets punished appropriately for it, even though it seems that he's decided correctly, both because the camels actually do it, and then again because it's echoed in the eulogy by this child. Okay, so I will pause there in terms of the looking at the sources themselves. I think you all have copies. You should feel free to continue to have them open in front of you. And Tani, I'm happy to take some more questions and comments now, and then I'll wrap up a little bit.
Okay, great, thank you. So one question, which I actually kind of noticed myself, is there a play on words between teeth and shinar? Is that just a coincidence?
Oh, interesting, because we have the shina is the teeth and shinar. Yeah, I think, sure, it's possible. The rabbis really like puns, so I would not put it beyond them to make that sort of pun. And if not, we can say that they did it, because there's nothing to stop us from doing so.
So one comment about kind of, what light does this put the rabbis in, in terms of how they're handling the situation here.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think part of what we see is that the structures that the rabbis have imposed on themselves are so strong and powerful that they can't get around them, even in cases where there then becomes sort of nothing to do, right? It's totally not clear. It seems to me that if the Arab hadn't interjected here, they would have just stood at that bridge forever, right? They'd like still be standing there. And so here the non-Jew becomes an important plot device almost to be able to move the story along. But yeah, it's a very strange story, right? Part of the reason that I brought it here is because I think the strangeness and the complexity and sort of the different layers, because we have the rabbis who have passed away, then we have the camels, we have the anonymous people driving the camels. Maybe the two are a unit that we should consider together. So the rabbis, then the camels and camel people, then you have the Arab, and then you have the child, right? And the Arab and the child in certain ways seem aligned with each other, but the Arab is punished in a way that the child is not. So then we have to ask the question of what are we supposed to do with that? Because that doesn't necessarily seem fair. But I think the answer is that the rabbis are invested in the child seeming wise and in touch with this tradition in a way that they aren't necessarily invested in the Arab. Again, am I supposed to read this as true that really there happened to be an Arab there? He solved the problem because he knew about the chains of respect due to different rabbis, and then all of his teeth fell out? Like, no, it seems unlikely to me that historically that's what's happening here. But I don't think that's the point, right? I think here the non-Jew becomes, on one hand, he comes to potentially the correct conclusion. But on the other hand, by virtue of bringing him in here, part of what you're doing is you're ensuring that the rabbis are insulated from suggesting that one of their sages is greater than the other, right? The only people who are willing to do that in this story are people who are outside, either because they're not Jews, or because they're children. And those people, interestingly, are able to speak honestly in a way that potentially the rabbis aren't, because I don't think that this idea that someone who is descended from a great line is owed even more respect than someone who isn't. That's not a crazy idea to the rabbis. It's not as if this is the only place that this shows up, but there's an anxiety about them stating it explicitly, which doesn't exist for the outsiders in the story. And that's why the child and the Arab are both able to do this in a way that the rabbis themselves can't.
Thank you. Do you want to take, we could ask one more question, or did you want to move on with your closing?
No, I'm happy to take another question.
Okay, so just a reflection about how, the rabbis in the story didn't want to put one above the other, and kind of, it's interesting how that is, to compare that to in one of the previous stories where it talks about how we're all equal. It was just an interesting parallel there.
Yeah, it is very interesting that there's this, and it's interesting that it becomes so fraught, because you could imagine that the camels just cross the bridge and nothing really happens and it's fine. But somehow this act of crossing the bridge becomes very fraught with meaning, partly because the rabbis make it that way. And you can also imagine someone coming along and say, just, flip a coin and pick someone or whatever else, right? That there's other ways to come to this decision. But this concern with not creating a hierarchy, because the hierarchy will suggest that one of these people does not deserve the respect that the rabbis think he does actually deserve, becomes actually paralyzing, right? It's actually an argument for, not for meritocracy, but for, like, Ezehu Chacham Halomed Mikol Adam, who is wise, the one who learns from everybody, because everyone's knowledge is valuable, and you don't want to suggest someone's knowledge is more valuable than someone else's, except that in all of these stories, right, and not surprisingly, because the rabbis are the ones telling these stories, but in all of these stories, the rabbi's knowledge is more valuable than the knowledge of the non-Jews, either because the non-Jews only ask the questions, but they don't provide answers, or because the non-Jews basically become an opportunity for the rabbis to show how smart they are, right? Oh, look at this difficult question the non-Jew asked that now I'm able to answer in this seemingly very obvious way that other people never would have thought of. That they become they become sort of like I can't access exactly the right word, but some sort of rebounder, right? Or almost a mirror in which the rabbis can put questions in their mouths to show their own wisdom, or they can put questions in their mouths to say, oh, actually, I would like to know more about this particular topic, but I'm worried that if I suggest, for example, that I don't know if there will be bodily resurrection because the body dissolves, I'm worried what the implications of that will mean in terms of what people will assume about my faith. But if I have this random, or this, this not random, but this prominent non-Jew ask that question, I can contend with it without suggesting that my faith is wavering around this. Right? It becomes useful to open up conversations that might otherwise feel like they're off limits.
So a question about, kind of how unusual these stories are within the context of the Talmud. You brought in a couple of examples, but are these kind of just very unusual? And I guess another earlier question was just also more about, in modern times, kind of how much does that idea, the notion of, that we shouldn't be learning with non-Jews, like how much is that present today?
Okay, those are both very, very good questions. So to answer the first question, I would say it's neither common nor uncommon, meaning these are a very small representative sample. The Talmud is extremely long, right? The Talmud, if you're going to learn a page of Talmud every single day, it takes 7.5 years. That's what Daf Yomi is. So the Talmud is very, very long. There are many places where non-Jews appear throughout the Talmud, but it is not one of the most common tropes, right? I would say it's sort of like the non-Jews are sort of like the recurring characters, meaning like on the TV show that you watch, like they pop up every so often. They're not there every episode. But when they show up, you don't say to yourself, wait, who is that and what's going on here? It's common enough. And there is an entire tractate, which is Avodah Zarah, which is about relationships between Jews and non-Jews. That's more legally focused. It's not necessarily narrative in this way, but there is generally an acknowledgement of the fact that part of what the rabbis have to and want to figure out how to do is how to engage with the non-Jewish world in general. So that's one piece of it. In terms of the question of what should we take from this today, the answer is it really depends who you ask. So at JTS, for example, if an undergraduate wants to go to JTS, they go to JTS and they go to Columbia or Barnard. That there's a sense that, of course, you should be also exposing yourself to the knowledge and the wisdom of the outside world, and that part of what's required of us as Jews is to get knowledge mikol adam, from every person, right? That we shouldn't only be getting knowledge from other Jews. We shouldn't only be getting knowledge from Jewish texts, but instead there's a whole wide world that we should be out there and learning from. Right, and even Yeshiva University, which is an Orthodox institution, their tagline is Torah Umada, which is Torah and like knowledge, science, right? However you want to translate the word Mada, right? This assumption that what it means to be a well-rounded person is to learn from and about things other than Judaism itself. That being said, in the more Haredi worlds, right, there's a total rejection of all of this. There's a rejection of both learning from non-Jews, of being in relationship with non-Jews, and also of the knowledge of non-Jews, particularly for the men and boys who are expected to sit and learn Torah all day. The women have more access to secular education than the men do. But based on that framework, you end up with something really different. You end up with a claim of basically like nothing good comes of our interacting with the outside world. And I think part of what it is the question of how strong is your faith in your faith in your community, your faith in Torah, to be able to stand up to this contact with the outside world, right? Because if you're concerned that when people learn about biology, they're going to reject the beginning of the book of Genesis, rather, then one way to deal with that is to stop people from learning about biology, right? Other people would say, no, that what it means to learn Torah is to be engaged in the larger world. And I would say that the Talmud itself is presenting good arguments for it here, because even in the places where the rabbis make the non-Jews look a little bit silly, they still want to be having those conversations, right? Even if especially I would say if these stories are creations of the authors more so than historical realities, it forces us to ask the question of why is it that the rabbis want to imagine themselves in dialogue about not only logistics of things like taxes and making sure that Jews aren't taken prisoner or whatever else, but these large philosophical questions? What does it mean that the rabbis want to be in dialogue with non-Jews about that? To me, part of what that says is they think there is a value in doing so. And even if that value is showing that you can hold your own with the best of and the most powerful of the non-Jewish community, to me, that's showing there's not necessarily, whether being cloistered is seen as an ideal and it's just an unrealistic ideal and therefore we can't be cloistered because it's the reality of the universe, or whether being cloistered is not the ideal, right? I think you can argue in either way. The rabbis are putting forward here a particular vision of what it means to interact with non-Jews, but they certainly don't seem to be suggesting that the ideal is to cut yourself off from them. And this sort of, plot device feels cynical. I don't mean it in a cynical way, but this sort of using of the non-Jew as a foil, but also as a mouthpiece for certain types of questions, I think is really important, because part of what it does is it tells us that even in places where the rabbis feel like certain questions are subversive, they still want to ask those questions, right? There's a desire to have those conversations, and they don't necessarily feel empowered to open them up because maybe they're outside of the realm of what they see as acceptable thought. But once whoever the character is, Caesar, Alexander, Cleopatra, a random Arab, right, whatever else it is, once those questions or those ideas are put on the table by those outside forces, part of what it does is it gives them the tools and mechanisms to then get to contend with them themselves. And I think ultimately that's a big part of what they want to be doing here. So we only have like 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to wrap up. Anyway, so as I said, this is a really small sampling of these stories, and you can go in many different directions. As I was preparing, I realized I could build like a whole multi-part series out of this and see where it goes. But the takeaway that I want is actually what I just said, which is that the rabbis don't imagine a reality in which they don't talk to the outside world. They imagine themselves being in conversation with the outside world, and B, that they want sometimes to be able to think about ideas that might be a little more subversive. And part of how non-Jews become good literary devices for them, essentially, is by putting those subversive ideas in the mouth of those non-Jews, because once the topic is on the table, the rabbis can say, oh, well, of course we have to answer these questions, right? I can't just let this question lie, because if I do, then maybe that'll suggest that, for example, I don't believe in the bodily resurrection of the dead or whatever else. And so, and then finally, I do think that as we especially see this in Alexander piece, even as the rabbis are saying, our values are different from Rome's values, and really setting up a clear contrast with Rome's values. At the same time, part of what we see is they clearly see, with Greece's values, they clearly see a value in engaging with those Greek values, or those Roman values, or those Egyptian values, if only to reject them. And so the fact that they're put on the table at all, rather than pretending that they don't exist, I think in many ways is a refutation to those who would argue that the way to maintain a cohesive religious community around piety and the like is through being cloistered. I think these texts are really a rejection of that, which feels to me like an important lesson, that there is wisdom of the whole world around us, and maybe what it means to say non-Jews are not supposed to learn Torah, but at the same time we can get wisdom from everyone, and therefore our job is to make sure we learn Torah, but we also learn other things as well. So I will stop there. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time. Thank you for coming and learning with me. I hope we get to do it again in the future, maybe even in person. And thank you to Tani for all of her help in preparing this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenthal, for the really fascinating session and bringing in the really interesting stories and ideas and sharing them with us. Thank you so much. We hope that you will join us next week, April 19th. Dr. Alexander Weisberg will be teaching us, the first time that he'll be teaching as part of this series. Our session next week will be Non-Human Others, the Jerusalem Talmud on Animal Ethics. So that's going to be a very different way of looking at the other. He'll be exploring what the Jewish tradition tells us about how we ought to treat and behave toward animals, and considering the ideal ethical stance for how to behave towards non-humans. So we hope you'll join us, and thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.